So I introduce you now, my friend and colleague, the illustrious Glenn E. Martin, Executive Vice President of the Fortune Society.
Good afternoon. Vivian, thank you for such a generous introduction. For folks who don't know, I am not only her boss as a result of being on her board, but she's my work wife. That's the way I like to think about it. Vivian is tough, but compassionate. And every day when I'm sharpened, a big part of it is the result of her really pushing me to do better and to do more. And I can't think of any diamonds that are created without being under that sort of pressure. So I really appreciate it. And it takes a diamond to sharpen another diamond. So thank you. So as I thought about today, with my schedule being what it is, about a week ago, I started taking time out to think of what my speech should be. And I thought about doing this long written out speech that definitely took criminal justice issues and the work we've been doing to reform the criminal justice system and show the overlap with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the provisions contained within those documents. And then today, as I got on the flight and I had my speech with me, I just happened to glance to the left as the plane took off from LaGuardia. And if you've ever taken off from LaGuardia, if you glance to the left, what you actually see is the second largest jail in the United States, Rikers Island. And the first thing I noticed was the barbed wire, and then looking at all the facilities, the many, many facilities that house 11,800 people there in New York. 11,800 people whose potential and hope is being stifled inside of those walls and behind those gates. And I decided that I wanted to do a presentation today that would make those folks proud of me. And so I decided to abandon the speech and think a bit on the airplane about what was happening there. I thought about the 11,800 people. I thought about the $168,000 per person per year that it costs to have a person there on Rikers Island. I thought about the fact that in New York we charge 16-year-olds as adults automatically. And I noticed Sophia Elijah just walked in the room. Hey, Sophia. Her organization is doing work to change that, and I really appreciate that work. But I thought about the factories of despair that I was leaving behind as that plane took off for Atlanta. And when I think about my work, I always think of the importance of being extremely pragmatic in the approach to the work. And so when I looked at today's conference and the words that were associated with the conference, the dignity and the justice and action, and I think of how much, while I'm a person who believes in the value of process, I definitely lean heavily towards action. And a big part of it is those men and women there on Rikers Island, the fact that they don't have the luxury of time for us in our approach to the work of revamping the system. And so when I think of even the Fortune client, so each year we see about 4,000 people. You know, Vivian started out mentioning that we're a direct service organization. Each year, 4,000 people who've been involved in the criminal justice system walk through our doors. And unfortunately, we live in a society that has robbed many of those young people of a vision for themselves in the future. Many of them walk through our door and literally have no sense of what their life may look like in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and therefore make their decisions in the moment. And a big part of what we do when they walk through the door is to help them see what that vision could be, to even believe in their future before they believe in their future. And so when I think of a human rights framing, and I think of starting criminal justice reform with all human beings deserve, Imagine that, a United States criminal justice system that begins and ends with all human beings deserve. Imagine where we can end up if that is the framing that we take towards rebuilding our criminal justice system. Because currently our criminal justice system operates on full throttle. Even at a time when crime is down, violent crime is down, we have a system that has an insatiable thirst for punishment. And I know during the conference you've heard some of these numbers, but they are worth repeating. We have 2.3 million people in prison today, 4.8 under some form of other supervision, parole, probation, ankle bracelets, and so on. 64 million Americans with some sort of criminal record on file with criminal record repositories, and 1 in 100 adults locked up in the United States. And then specifically for black men, 1 in 3 black men are destined to be involved in the criminal justice system in their lifetime. And we talk about the school to prison pipeline. I like to think of it as the womb to prison pipeline for men of color. And so over the last 4 decades, we've criminalized behaviors, we've lengthened sentences, we've engaged in the adultification of our children, and the system continues to operate like a well-oiled machine. And what troubles me the most is that sometimes we don't slow down long enough to realize that we give it life, that the system operates and continues to operate because we believe in it in some ways, even those of us who are in a position to change it. And so in many ways, we have to remember that we actually have the power to change it because we're a big part of the reason that it exists. And what's inherent to this system is that to keep it working, one of the first things that it does is to rob people of their dignity and their humanity. So imagine a system that starts with all human beings deserve. So our criminal justice system is not just about what happens behind those prison walls, because the punishment extends into the community, beyond the prison gates. And so you have the end of the civil rights era, you have this huge spike in incarceration, mass incarceration. If you extrapolate those numbers, it's mostly men of color, women of color, increasingly women in general going into the system. And then you have all of this lifetime punishment that in my mind clearly diminishes all the gains we've made during the civil rights era. And I think of the 4 E's: education, employment, enfranchisement, equality. All easily taken away, not necessarily by race-based discrimination, but by criminal record discrimination, which has the same effect because of the disproportionate impact of the criminal justice system. So all of our policies that are criminal record based, whether intentional or not, serve as a surrogate for race-based discrimination here in the United States. So imagine the hypocrisy in a system that houses people that for the most part are the products of our other failed policies, right? I think of how many people, I think of Vivian's work. Vivian serves as America's conscience, if you will, around issues on the intersection of education and the criminal justice system. And some of the work that she's doing with the Education Inside Out Coalition, which we co-founded together, is around looking at barriers to education for people who are currently on the inside and post-release. And imagine a country where we admit that our education system has not been working and that there are all these people who are products of that failed system, and many of them end up in the criminal justice system, and as punishment, we decide that we won't give them access to education, especially when all of the evidence says that it reduces recidivism and reduces reoffending. I think of technology and all the amazing things technology has done for our lives. Vivian just now was saying, when is our flight back? And I said, I don't know. And she said, you never really know these things. Why? I said, I rely heavily on technology. Think of all the things technology can do for us these days. But when it comes to the criminal justice system, we use technology to further punish people. Within the criminal justice system, technology doesn't seem to be something that we're willing to use to have better outcomes in our criminal justice system. So I think of how wide Pandora's box is open on this idea of background checks and keeping the scarlet letter on a person who's been involved in the criminal justice system. How technology is used to keep formerly incarcerated people out, to further marginalize them. I think of the fact that we live in a country that says to get a job, you must go through an extensive background check. But to get a gun, So we have a criminal justice system whose architecture relies on silos, right? It's such a large system that that's the only way it can continue to operate is by building silos. And a few ways that it reinforces those silos, one includes language. And I'm sure you guys have spoken about the importance of the language we use to talk about people who've been involved in the criminal justice system, to move away from the language that's been given to us by the system. Prisoners and convicts and ex-offenders. It's hard to imagine we should help an inmate. Those are not natural terms to talk about human beings. We're talking about people. And I've been up here already talking for about 10 minutes, and I've not used any of those words. And I think we should all strive hard to move away from that language, to rehumanize people who've been involved in the system. The system goes so far as to even take away our names and give us numbers. I can remember my number, 96A 3612. It's a number I'll never forget. The system uses geography to separate, laws, practices. And now let's turn the lens on us criminal justice advocates. So we've tried to fight the beast on its own terms. We've siloed our own work. Unfortunately, we don't have much of a shared vision. We don't have much in the way of shared values. We don't have much in the way of shared tools. We don't have much in the way of shared morals. We don't have much in the way of shared leadership. In some ways, we've mimicked the system's divisiveness. So I think of folks who are working on important immigration issues, and I cringe when I hear them say on television, well, it's not like they're criminals. I think of folks who are working on juvenile justice issues, and I cringe when they say, well, they're not adults, they're not hardened criminals. And I cringe when I hear folks who are working on drug law reform say, well, they didn't convict violent crimes. You know what I know from sitting in the arraignment part of criminal court, which I do every once in a while very deliberately, that it's hard to distinguish the guy who comes through today with a violent crime and the guy who comes through the next day with a drug crime. Because a lot of times it's all a matter of when they got picked up by the police. And yet, as soon as they end up in the system, because this system is such a juggernaut of a system, it silos people based on those charges. So I would argue that our approach, with some small victories, has been a failure. And that's a criticism of everyone's work, my own. But then I say, imagine a system where all human beings deserve, where that's the language we use to think about the system. And then I get excited when I think about the human rights framework and what sort of bridge it can create between all those different pieces of work that I just mentioned. The shared framing, the shared values, the shared vision, the shared tenets when you use the human rights framework to approach this issue. And how the human rights framework can also address stigma, even amongst people who are in the criminal justice system. When people are doing time and other people come through, they say, I'm here for a robbery, he's here for a sex offense. I'm not him. Even people in the system create these silos, which again mimics the way the system is set up. The deserving, the non-deserving, the good, the bad, the evil, the good. If you care about human rights work, then prisons in the United States really are the belly of the beast. And like Vivian, when we lost Mandela a few days ago, I was reminded when I thought about the people who are still in the system, not of their deficits, but of their assets. And I think that if we're going to build a people-centered movement, then the oxygen in any effective movement is the people. And as I think about the creation of Just Leadership USA, which is going to be doing leadership development of people directly impacted, advocacy work on the federal and state level, and working to change public opinion, I was reminded that the seeds of this organization was planted in my head many, many years ago, because everyone's asking me now, like, when did you come up with this model? And it was planted in my head many, many years ago. And I'll tell you a story. So when I got arrested many years ago, I had about 7 different co-defendants. And one of them was pretty violent in his approach, physically violent to other people. And that played out not just when he was on the outside, but when he was in prison. And I remember being in a cell, in a holding cell behind the courts. And I remember him coming in the cell with me, and we were talking. And then he saw a person come into the cell who he saw as an enemy of his. And he immediately attacked the guy by spitting out a razor blade and cutting his face. I remember seeing him about 2 years later in a prison upstate. I did 6 years altogether. And he had went to the box for 2 years after cutting this guy, and he got a new charge, which gave him more time in prison. And we were just having a friendly, casual conversation, and we were in a facility that didn't have microwaves or anything like that. And I remember telling him I wish I could have a cup of tea, and he said, "Don't worry, we can make a cup of tea." And I was like, "How? We don't have anything to make tea." And he said, "No, I'm going to show you." And he took a 2-liter plastic bottle, and he put water in the bottle, and he tied a string to the top of the bottle and hung it from the light fixture. And he hung it low enough so that he could wrap a roll of toilet tissue very tightly on the floor and light it and have the bottle spin on top of the tissue as the tissue burned slowly. And eventually the bottle shrunk, but the water began to boil. And I remember juxtaposing that against what I thought I already knew about him. And I started to think more deeply about him. And I write him all the time now. I was writing him a letter on the airplane on the way here. And what I saw is that if we silo people like that in the system that we've created, then we forget that when you lock up 2.3 million people, that you've gone way beyond protecting us from bad people, and that you have extinguished huge amounts of potential and opportunity and things that can change this world. So then I thought of Mandela again. I thought of his quote that said, "In my country, we go to prison first, then we become president." So I believe in individual responsibility, absolutely. But I also believe in social responsibility, and I believe in community involvement. And that's why the human rights framework works for me. When I went into the criminal justice system to do 6 years for an armed robbery charge, I remember my own thoughts about people who've been involved in the criminal justice system being challenged as I went through that system. The toughest day in prison for me was walking out of prison, because I left so many amazing people behind. I cried on the walkway on my way out of prison. 2 quick stories that happened for me when I was in prison that helped the way I think about the system. One was on my way out. There was a correction officer on the housing block where I was for the entire 6 years. And as he was talking to me and sort of wishing me well and reminiscing about some of the stuff that's happened in the housing block, I happened to stay in that one housing block in that one prison, which is highly unusual. Usually people end up 10 hours away from home and then sort of work their way back. And I stayed there because I was in a college program, and I earned a degree while I was there, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But the story about the correction officer was in the middle of the conversation. He said, "Glenn, you know, you being here helped me to buy my boat, and when your son gets here, he's going to help my son buy his boat." And that was the feeling I had when he said it, the sort of emotion that came out in this room just now. But it was one of the most important things anyone said to me in my life, definitely in my career, because it allows me to realize that if you continue to have a conversation about criminal justice reform with just criminal justice advocates, you are engaging in a very Sisyphean task. That this system is so much broader than punishment and criminal justice and who deserves what, that this system is an economic engine in the United States. So a 5-minute interaction with a correction officer. The other 5-minute interaction was on my way into the system, where I took a test, and a correction counselor approached me and looked at my grades and said, "Wow." He said, "I've never seen such good grades. You should go to college." And it was the first time anyone had said that to me. It could have been said to me 10 years earlier in Bed-Stuy, where I grew up in Brooklyn. But it wasn't. It was said to me by a correction counselor in prison. And when I think of that correction counselor and the fact that he saw hundreds of people per day and thousands of people per year, if not tens of thousands, I wonder whether he was thinking that all human beings deserve. Because he made sure I ended up at a facility with a college program where the college programs almost don't exist anymore because we were being so tough on crime back in 1994 when we passed the Violent Crime and Control Act that President Bill Clinton signed into law. So I think of his humanity, and I think of his compassion, and I think of his willingness to expose me to opportunity. And I realize that my story is no different. You know, people like to say, well, Glenn, you're the exception. I'm not the exception. I often offer people a copy of my rap sheet. If you think I'm the exception, take a look at my rap sheet. You know what the exception is? That I was exposed to exceptional opportunities. That's what became the exception for me. So I thought of another quote for Mandela, and this one I wrote down, it's pretty long. What counts in life is not the mere fact that we have lived. It is what difference we have made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life we lead. And so as I launched Just Leadership USA with the goal of cutting the amount of people in prison in half over the next 15 to 20 years, I'm definitely going to be doing it thinking about how we create a system that begins and ends with all human beings deserve. Thank you.